Did you know that in Brazil, a group of Muslim slaves started a rebellion in the country which eventually led to slavery being outlawed? You see, in the 1500s, the British, French, Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese empires were exploring and building colonies in the newly discovered Americas. And at the same time, these empires set up posts all over West Africa, buying over 10 million slaves in a slave trade that lasted 400 years. These slaves were then sent to the Americas to work in the new colonies, the most famous place being the southern part of the US. But in fact, only a few 100,000 slaves actually made it to the US, which is only a fraction of the 10 million slaves in total. Most of the slaves ended up in South America and the Caribbean, with 5 million human beings enslaved in just Brazil alone. And because they were taking their slaves from West Africa, a lot of them were Muslim. One of the biggest populations of Muslims in Brazil was the city of Bahia. And it just so happened that many slaves from Nigeria were sent there, in particular from the Hausa and the Yoruba tribes, both of which are Muslim. They began creating secret communities and giving da'wah to the other slaves in the city. And by the 1800s, Islam and the Muslims were a well-respected force among the slaves. Freed slaves often made their homes masjids for the Muslims to gather in secret, or sometimes they rented out rooms in the downtown core instead. And some of the slaves who could speak and read Arabic would teach the Quran to others and help in the da'wah scene. And it was around this time that a slave rebellion was happening in another country, the Haitian Revolution, which was possibly the first slave rebellion in history to actually succeed. Slowly but surely, ideas of rebellion here in Bahia began to float around the community, and leaders started making names for themselves. The revolt was planned to take place on Sunday, January 25th, during the month of Ramadan in 1835. The night before, slaves spread rumors amongst themselves to let everyone know, but it was during this planning phase that tragedy struck. An ex-slave woman by the name of Sabina de Cruz had a fight with her husband the day before and went looking for him. She found him in a house with many of the other revolt organizers, and when she heard about the planned revolt, she immediately went to a friend who she knew had access to the whites. This friend then went to tell her white neighbor, who then told his friends, who then told the authorities about the planned revolt. And when the chief of police heard the situation, he reinforced the palace guard, alerted the barracks, doubled the night patrol, and ordered the boats to watch the bay. The police began searching the houses of suspected ex-slaves who may be involved in the rebellion. And it just so happens that in one of the houses they searched, the rebellion leaders were discussing the final details of the plot. And all of this happened the night before the rebellion was supposed to start. A fight broke out and some of the leaders managed to escape and started the revolt early. 2 people were immediately killed, one of which was the husband of Sabina, who had spread the news about the rebellion in the first place. The rebels started attacking the prisons to free one of the leaders and recruit inmates to join the rebellion. But the attack failed and the prison guards were able to hold off the slaves. They then retreated, getting reinforcements from the slaves in the city, and attacked an army barracks hoping to get weapons for the revolt. They put up a fight, but eventually the guards managed to get the gates of the barracks shut, locking the slaves out. Several times they regrouped and attacked different army barracks, but each time they were unsuccessful. And by now the slaves had numbered several hundred, but because they no longer had the element of surprise, they were unable to achieve any of their goals. It was now 3 in the morning, they had no weapons, they were tired, they were desperate, and looking at the situation, they realized they either took the barracks or they died a painful death. So they charged the barracks one last time and they were shot down. In total, 80 slaves were killed and 300 were captured in the failed rebellion. And the authorities were afraid that another rebellion could happen. So they executed and imprisoned the remaining leaders and sent the rest of the rebels back to Africa, where they worked as slaves in one of the other Portuguese colonies there. And by the way, some of their descendants still live in Africa, including the first president of Togo. Back in Brazil, the authorities had begun heavily oppressing the Muslims, forcing many of them to convert to Christianity and trying to wipe out the positive image and respect that the Muslims held there. And by 1910, only 100,000 African Muslims remained in Brazil. And at the same time, the failed rebellion began a widespread discussion of the end of the transatlantic slave trade, which was heavily debated in the media and eventually led to the abolition of slavery in 1851. I guess the takeaway from this story is, be very careful if your wife is angry with you. She just might snitch on your rebellion. Like and follow for more Muslim facts.